Uh, my name is Cohen, Ted Cohen. I'm a member of the philosophy department here. I have been that for a long time. Uh, my specialty is the philosophy of art. Unfortunately, through a kind of mistake, since the 18th century, called aesthetics. It would be better not to call it that, better to call it the philosophy of art. That's my specialty. I also do a little work in the philosophy of language, and I work some in the history of philosophy, but mostly in the history of the philosophy of art. Those are the kinds of courses I teach. I occasionally teach courses in the philosophy of music, which are fun because half the students come from the music department and half from the philosophy department, which means that everything I say in class bores half the class, is incomprehensible to the other half, and it's kind of fun to try doing that. Now I'm, of course, in two wonderful philosophers. One is really wonderful, the other is just very important. From the 18th century, David Hume and Immanuel Kant. Hume is the wonderful philosopher, Kant is the important philosopher. The older I've gotten, the less I like Kant, but I teach it. Anyway, the aesthetics of Hume and Kant is what I'm teaching now. If you want to talk about that, that's okay with me. Today I'm going to talk to you about this other topic, or other thing. I always like talking with you at open houses, but I'm always unsure just what to talk about. So I decided this year I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I'm working on, at least one thing I'm working on, and then ask for a little help. Not bad to get some help. A few years ago, I wrote a book about jokes. And recently, I wrote a book about metaphor. It didn't occur to me until about a year ago. I was in Maine, where I go with my wife in the summer. These two topics, jokes and metaphors, are related. What relates them is the fact that both metaphors and many, although not all, jokes rules. The rules broken by jokes, or at least by some jokes, are what might be thought of as social rules, rules of decorum, social correctness, whereas the rules broken by metaphor are the rules of language. Now, I'm happy to talk with you about both metaphors and jokes, but in this brief presentation, I want to talk only about metaphor, and in particular, first, a rather important thing, that is the difference between metaphor and ambiguity, and then how it is that what metaphor does is to require a certain kind of creativity, not on the part of the person who makes a metaphor, but on our part, if we're able to do it, when we understand the metaphor. So, metaphor and ambiguity, we need to get something straight, even if there's not universal agreement about these things. Until relatively recently, it was common to think of metaphor as a kind of ambiguity, maybe a species of ambiguity. It has become clear that this is an extremely misleading way of thinking about metaphor. If you look at books on linguistics, where people are serious about language, or books by English professors who are serious about something, maybe not so serious about language, as recently as I would say maybe 25 or 30 years ago, metaphor is always discussed as a kind of ambiguity. Now, the temptation to think of metaphor as a kind of ambiguity arises from the obvious fact that with both metaphor and ambiguity, there's a single expression that can be taken two ways, sometimes more than two ways, more than one way. So, here are four ambiguous expressions. I spent last night on a cape. I put my money in a bank. Saw her duck. As an example came out of MIT about 25 years ago. I like civil engineers. Now, in the first example, I spent last night on a cape. I might be telling you that last night I was with my friend Peter Kivy, his home in Falmouth on Cape Cod. I sometimes am with Peter on Cape Cod. And when I'm there, I spend the night on a cape. Or I might be saying that wherever I spent the night, I lay on a garment of the kind favored by Sherlock Holmes. The word cape is one of no more than a few hundred words in English which are genuinely ambiguous. In the second example, I put my money in a bank. I'm probably announcing that I've deposited my money in some place designed to accept such deposits, but I might be saying it, that is, I put my money in a bank, that I've hidden my money in the mud by a river. There's an additional ambiguity of sorts in this because the word bank might refer to a specific building or it might refer to an institution. In the third case, I saw her duck, there's an interesting and rather amusing syntactic ambiguity because the word duck might be a verb, I saw her duck, in which case I saw her lower her head, or it might be a noun, in which case I saw a fowl that belongs to her. And of course, if you have some imagination, you can imagine them all kind of going together. I mean, maybe she ducked because her duck was flying over her head, but whatever. The fourth example, that is, I like civil engineers, displays multiple possibilities because the term civil engineer could refer to engineers often to be well-mannered and certainly not sullen, although it's unstipulated just what kind of engineers they are, and in fact, they might be locomotive drivers. Or, I like civil engineers, could refer to members of a profession that deals with civic structures like bridges and highways. Now, in every one of these cases, and it's not hard to find examples of ambiguity, the two possible meanings, so to speak, reside in the words, even if it remains unclear which meaning is relevant. The situation is entirely different with metaphor. For instance, in the case of the now rather time-worn example from Shakespeare, Juliet is the sun, the two ways of taking it are not, so to speak, just waiting there to be picked out. If you take the sentence literally, Juliet is the sun, it's not only false, but it's preposterous. For what it says is that Juliet is the bright heavenly body that wakes up at dawn and leaves at sunset. If you take it as a metaphor, Juliet is the sun, it says that Juliet is the brightest thing Romeo knows, that she warms and brightens his world, that she's more striking than other men's girlfriends, who strike as the moon, which is what Shakespeare's contemporaries were always saying about their girlfriends. But what's critical is that the metaphorical meaning, if that's what it is related to the literal meaning, so that if you don't understand the literal sense of the remark, you have no hope of arriving at its metaphorical import. Things are entirely different with ambiguity. In the cases of ambiguity, it's entirely possible to grasp either of the meanings, not only without regard to the other, but in complete ignorance of the other. Thus, even if it were unproblematic, as not, to speak metaphorical meaning, one would have to note that metaphorical meaning is related to and depends upon a sentence's literal meaning, whereas with ambiguous utterances, neither of the possible meanings depends on the other. Now, in examples like Juliet is the sun, the sentence taken literally is quite obviously false, even perhaps absurd. And such examples led early theorists of metaphor to suppose that this is a common feature of metaphorical utterances, and that indeed it is the obvious unacceptability of the utterance in its literal sense that indicates to an audience that something else should be looked for. When Toscanini was conducting the orchestra in New York, he stopped during a rehearsal and objected to the first chair trumpet for the way the trumpet had played. The trumpeter replied that he'd played correctly, and Toscanini simply didn't know what he was talking about. There ensued an argument, at the end of which the trumpet player simply got up and walked off the rehearsal stage. And as he got to the wings of the stage, he turned around, and as he was leaving, said to Toscanini, "Schmuck." And Toscanini said, it's too late to apologize. So now we get back to the idea that what happens when you try to take a metaphor literally is you wind up with something either absurd or at least quite plainly false, and that's how you know that you better look for something else. In fact, when I was young, I can barely remember, the dean of American philosophy of art, a man named Monroe Beardsley, a wonderful man, now dead, had written the entries about metaphor in the Encyclopedia of Philosophy and other places, and he had said this, that what happens when you take a metaphor literally is you wind up with something unacceptable, and that's how you know you should look for something else. And I was reading this stuff, and I thought that isn't right. And I wrote to him, and he was one of those strange people in my profession who was very welcoming and understanding and accepting of younger people when they do what younger people in my profession do, which is to make their bones by criticizing older figures. And so I wrote to him and I said, well, what about this? The graffito I found on the Classics building elevator wall. The sun is a gas. That literally, it's okay. And he wrote back and he said, well, that's just a joke. I wrote back and I said, well, what about Hitler as an animal? He said, well, that's not bad, but it's still kind of contrived. So finally I sent him, No Man is an Island. And he wrote back and he said, yes, I guess it's okay. That's real, isn't it? That's a poem. That's from John Donne. We have to take it seriously. So now, if you don't know that something is a metaphor, or that you should try to take it figuratively, because you can't take it literally, because when you do, it's obviously false, what are you supposed to say? Well, you've got examples like No Man is an Island, or here's an example from me, this painting by Mondrian is flat. In both cases, the sentence is a literal truth. But in both cases, there's a metaphorical import waiting to be uncovered. Now, the example from John Donne, what I'm going to say a little more about later, is somewhat less interesting, although it's a better line than mine, because No Man is an Island appears as something like the conclusion of an argument, one of whose premises is impossible as a literal truth. This is the argument. Every man is part of mankind. Mankind is a continent. No part of a continent is an island. Therefore, no man is an island. The first premise, mankind is a continent, is, like Juliet is the sun, wildly false. This Mondrian painting is flat, is more instructive. Taken literally, of course, the sentence is true, because this painting, say it's Broadway Boogie Woogie or your favorite Mondrian, that painting is flat, just like almost all paintings are flat, including those of Rembrandt and Velázquez. But taken metaphorically, what the sentence says is that unlike paintings by Rembrandt and Velázquez, this painting by Mondrian has no depth. Mondrians are all on the surface. Well, then you might suppose that the characteristic of literal readings of metaphorical utterances is not that they're obviously false, but that they're either obviously false or obviously true. What matters is the obviousness, because it is, so to speak, a rule which we've known since a wonderful professor named Paul Grice pointed it out to us, that utterances are not used to announce things that are obviously already known to whomever this utterance is addressed. That's no doubt a better idea than the claim that the sentence must be false, but it is also, in the end, no more defensible, because examples like this, quotation of two sections from one of the shortest books in the Bible. I don't know what you call this. It's sometimes called Canticles. It's sometimes called the Song of Solomon. In Hebrew, it's called the Shirim, so it ought to be called the Song of Songs. In the Song of Songs, there are 4 different speakers. If you don't identify them, you can get a little confused, but it isn't hard to tell what's happening. There's a young woman, sometimes she speaks. Sometimes the speaker is a young man. Sometimes the speaker are the brothers of the young woman. And sometimes the speakers are the girlfriends of the young woman, called the daughters of Jerusalem. In this 2-part section, the first speaker is the young woman. And she says this: "Awake, north wind, O south wind, come, breathe upon my garden. Spices stream out. Let my lover come into his garden and taste its delicious fruit." And the young man answers, "I have come into my garden, my sister, my bride. I have gathered my myrrh and my spices. I have eaten from the honeycomb. I have drunk the milk and the wine." It is possible to take these lines absolutely literally without encountering anything obvious, either obviously true or obviously false. And yet, of course, there is a figure of speech waiting to be discovered, and nearly every reader of these lines takes them to concern the sexual awakening of a young woman and a young man. When she says, "Come into my garden," she's saying, "Let's get it on." And he's saying, "We did, and it was swell." Now, of course, neither the rabbis nor the church fathers can accept this reading. And the church fathers tell you that it's not about love making, it's about Jesus' love for the church. And the rabbis say, no, no, it's not about physical love making, it's about God's love for Israel. An interesting thing is that you can't prove anything. You're just struggling with different interpretations, which is one of the reasons why somebody interested in the philosophy of art should be interested in this. This is what happens when you interpret a work of art. I tell you that what King Lear is about is the impossibility of getting old. Or I tell you that Polanski's wonderful movie Chinatown is about the fact that there are things in the world that we simply cannot understand. Or I tell you that Mozart's opera Don Giovanni is about what music really is. I can't prove any of that. I'm right about all those things, but I can't be proven. Just argue about it in the way that the rabbis and the church fathers and other readers of the Song of Songs argue about how to get some kind of metaphorical content out of this. The reason, of course, is that no rules governing that. Now, in all cases of metaphor, no matter how it may or may not be signaled that a metaphor is afoot, there is no way to demonstrate with certainty how it's to be taken. That's to say that although the literal reading may be fixed by the grammar of the language, the metaphorical reading is not determined in that way. In the case of ambiguity, both ways are indeed determined by the language's grammar. The grammar offers two readings. But in the case of metaphor, the second way of taking it exists in a kind of freedom. I like that. Now, before going on to an elaboration of this freedom, I want to say a little bit more about ambiguity and metaphor. It's obvious that metaphors often appear in serious literary texts. Lyric poetry wouldn't be there without metaphors. It's perhaps a little less obvious that so does ambiguity. Shakespeare is an author who makes use of both devices, of ambiguity and metaphor. We've already had as an example Romeo's declaration, Juliet is the sun, and there are many throughout Shakespeare's works. Here's an example of his use of ambiguity. In Hamlet, you'd be much better off, if you want to talk about Hamlet, going over there talking about it with David Bevington, but I'm okay on this. In Hamlet, the prince says to Ophelia, "Get thee to a nunnery." In Elizabethan English, the word nunnery was used as a slang reference to a whorehouse. Everybody in Shakespeare's time knew that. The use of the word nunnery to mean a whorehouse may once originally have been a figure of speech. Quickly falls into a literal sense, no more a figure of speech than is, say, son of a bitch or bastard. So in Hamlet's line, when he speaks to poor Ophelia, we have a single word with two possible literal meanings. So, is Hamlet telling Ophelia to take the veil, become a nun, or is he telling her to become a prostitute? It's a favorite idea of mine, you should check this with David Bevington, that Shakespeare intends exactly this ambiguity, and that Hamlet is presenting Ophelia with it. That is, he is presenting her with an obscenely welcome choice. She hopes for a romantic relationship with Hamlet, and he is refusing, telling her that she can either renounce all hopes of a romance, become a nun, or seek its vulgar version, become a whore. Metaphors can also be doubled. Some literary texts present not two literal meanings, but two metaphors, each of the same thing. I thought we were going to have a handout, but you'll just have to remember this. You can look it up. Here are two texts from one of John Donne's meditations. This is actually from... Oh, you do have it. Great. This is from... I knew nothing. I know microphones, hand up. This is from the Devotional Meditation 17. But I'll read it for you anyway. No man is an island entirely of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as any manner of thy friends of thine own were. Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind. And therefore, never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. Where would Hemingway be without things like that? But within the same text, there's this. You want a guy who can make metaphor read undone. All mankind is of one author and is one volume. Man dies, One chapter is not torn out of the book, but is translated into a better language. And each chapter must be so translated. It employs several translators. Some pieces are translated by age, some by sickness, some by war, some by justice. God's hand is in every translation, and his hand shall bind up our scattered leaves again, for that library where every book shall lie open one another. This is great stuff. It's close to turning people like me into Christians, but only that close. No close. Now, in Shakespeare's sonnet, the 73rd sonnet, there's an amazing combination of ambiguity and metaphor. At least so I claim. Here I have an argument with my friend Richard Stryer, who's an expert in this, but I don't care. Richard and I remain good friends because we argue. Here's the entire poem. It's only part of it, but we should have the whole thing because we're actually in this time of year. Time of year thou mayst in me behold, when yellow leaves or none or few do hang upon those boughs which shake against the cold. Bare ruined choirs, where late the sweet birds sang. In me thou seest the twilight of such day as after sunset fadeth in the west, which by and by black night doth take away, death's second self, that seals up all in rest. In me thou seest the glowing of such fire that on the ashes of his youth doth lie, as the deathbed whereon it must expire, consumed with that which it was nourished by. This thou perceivest, which makes thy love more strong to love that well, which thou must leave long. Pretty good. This poem seems clearly to describe a man who is older, beyond his prime, anticipating the end of his life. In the fourth line, the poet says you may see in him, quote, bare ruined choirs, where late the sweet birds sang. The image seems to be of a choir loft, perhaps in a country church. The loft is now empty and in disrepair. Once it held sweet singers, perhaps children. Now it is empty and no song is heard. Fine. Well, the word choir, C-H-O-I-R, has a homophone, choir, Q-U-I-R-E. And that word refers to a small collection of papers. Heard in this way, the fourth line of the sonnet seems to refer to some pages, now bare and ruined, some blank, and some perhaps with words or lines that have been struck out. Then to find these in the poem would be to find him no longer able to produce the poetry he once wrote. Of late, the sweet birds sang through him, but no longer. I have a little footnote here. Not to burden you with the whole thing, but you should run into Stryer and he tells you, Cohen keeps telling me that Shakespeare's use of the word choir is ambiguous. That can't be right. I'm claiming only that one can read a line that way. And in any argument between me and Richard Stryer about how to read Shakespeare, the smart money is on Stryer. I do note, however, are you here, Rich? In the Quinto version of the sonnet, the word is written Q-U-I-E-R-S. Right. Richard, you're usually right, but not fine. Anyway, I like taking that fourth line as ambiguous, capable of being read with a metaphorical import of either an empty and silent choir loft or a wordless poet. Then the line is ambiguous, and in each of its two possible literal readings, it gives rise to a different metaphor. That's wonderful. Now, whether or not you agree the line can have a second metaphorical import, the line certainly, metaphorically, refers to a man no longer able to do what he once did well. Is that man the poet of this sonnet? Perhaps. But if so, then I think that the time of year when he makes this sonnet is not the time of year he's referring to. Why? He must be anticipating some later time when his poetic well will have run dry, because the sonnet itself is achingly beautiful. The birds are still singing sweetly in this sonnet, which is about a time when they don't sing. Well, If the metaphorical upshot in utterance is not fixed by the standard rules of language, then in finding or constructing that metaphorical upshot is free, at least the normal linguistic constraints. But this also means that however well we know the rules of the language, this will not be enough for us when we set out to figure out the metaphor. It is here that our own ingenuity is required, and we will have to succeed doing something that is very, very hard to describe. Now, I want to say something about this rules of language business. I don't want to make heavy weather of this. I want to admit straight off something. Although I keep talking about how all of us who are native and competent speakers of English know the rules of English, it's a little difficult to maintain this view unless you're Noam Chomsky, who is a genius, operates from planet Chomsky, and you're willing to say this. The plain truth is that if we went around this room right now and asked all of you, including me, we probably wouldn't articulate any of the rules of language. We might make a shot at something, but we'd wind up saying something silly, I before E. It's not even true. Chomsky thinks that we must know these rules because we use them, so he says we know them innately. Well, you can agree or not agree with that, but they're there. And I want to give you a kind of example of this, just in order to make this kind of clear. Here are two examples of things that I might say. My wife, Andy, and I spend time in Maine every summer. Another one. Native Mainers are kind to Andy and me. Now, in the first sentence, I use the pronoun I to refer to myself, and in the second sentence, I use me. My wife, Andy, and I spend time. Mainers are kind to Andy and me. That's because I follow syntactic rules that take the pronoun to be part of the subject in the first sentence, but treat it as the object of a preposition in the second sentence, and because I take the subjective case of the pronoun to be I, while the objective case is me. I'm following those rules of the language. On the other hand, in both cases, I put the name Andy before the pronoun that refers to me. Thus I say, Andy and I spend time, and people are kind to Andy and me. This is not because of any purely linguistic rule, but is rather a kind of courtesy rule, requiring I name myself last. Rather like I would follow if I were introducing you to Andy, and I had to introduce you and Andy to one another. I mean, I follow those kinds of rules. If you're a man and I were introducing you to Andy, I would say, Andy, this is Butch. Butch, this is Andy. On the other hand, if I were introducing Andy to an older woman, I would say, Bertha, this is Andy. Andy, this is Bertha. That sort of thing. My mother brought me up that way. If someone spoke like a valley girl and said, me and Andy go to Maine, he would violate one rule of language and another rule of courtesy. He does all the time. And I'm sorry to say it, although I'm not one of those who believes that the world has going or has gone to hell in a handbasket, I'll tell you this, the writing in newspapers is worse than when I was young. I pointed out to my wife today 3 or 4 mistakes in the Chicago. Somebody had written about the Cellini trial, which my wife is currently covering, that with regard to these two people, each of them would do something apiece. It's just redundant. I mean, it's one or the other. And when I was a boy, we were told, and I believed it, that the New Yorker was the best fact and editorial checked magazine in the world. Every issue of the New Yorker now has weird mistakes in it. But of course, what accompanies that is the advent of pop grammarians, people like the late William Safire, who are forever complaining about the language and don't know what they're talking about. I remember in particular a column of Safire's in which he excoriated the use of the word accessorize. You know, when you buy your new Buick, you'll be given $500 and 30 you can accessorize the car in any way that you'd like. Well, I don't like the word accessorize much. I certainly don't use it. But what Safire said was it was not acceptable to take this noun accessory, pull it forward in the sentence, and turn it into a verb. English has been making verbs in that way for 500 years. There was a and when you couldn't ship anything anywhere. You could send it by ship, but the noun ship got pulled forward in the thing. There was a time when you could, in fact, trap somebody in a corner, but now you can corner someone. Of course English works that way. I'm not that kind of prude. I'm another kind of prude. But anyway, so there are these rules. And what linguists do and philosophers of language is try to figure out what they are. And it's interesting to see just how much you actually can figure out. Particularly when you're confronted with the kind of rubbish we were taught as children. You mustn't split an infinitive. Bull. It comes from the completely mistaken idea that the grammar of English is the grammar of Latin. Of course you can't split an infinitive in Latin, it's all one word. But of course you can split them in English, it's okay. It's an end a sentence with a preposition. It comes from the completely erroneous idea that the grammar of English is like the grammar of German. Can't do it in German, but next time somebody tells you that, I bet people say it to you every day, right? Don't. Your sentence with a preposition. There are two things you can say. The direct, polite thing to say is, if I said to you, Charlie is looking something up in a book, you ask, what is Charlie looking up? I'd like you to find a way of asking that question that doesn't end the sentence with a preposition. You can't do it. Or you could, of course, tell the story about the young man from the South, in his first day in Harvard Yard, stopping an upperclassman and saying to him, "Excuse me, will you tell me where is the library at?" And the upperclassman said, "At Harvard, you don't end sentences with prepositions." And so the young man from the South said, "Oh, excuse me, try again. Will you please tell me where the library is at, asshole?" We weren't going to do jokes today, but it's always a nice thing. Also, there was just a wonderful line written in a Chicago newspaper that doesn't yet still exist, either the American or the Daily News. You remember the Leopold and Loeb affair, happened at this university in this neighborhood. You may not remember that Loeb, they were both sentenced to life in prison, although Leopold was eventually let out. Loeb died there. He was killed by a prisoner after he made an unwanted sexual advance to this other prisoner, who then killed him. And some Chicago reporter said this was the first time anybody knew of a sentence being ended by proposition. That's what I think, except you try to make something up yourself. It's not so easy. All right. So what I'm saying is that the rules of the language do function in understanding literal things, but when you encounter a metaphor, there are no rules that you can use. When you encounter the line in Macbeth, "Macbeth doth murder sleep," a rule of the language has been violated. There are a lot of different semantic theories out there, but they all have to say this, that the use of murder as a transitive verb requires as an object a living thing, maybe even a human being. Murder sleep. Sleep is not the name of a living thing. A rule has been broken. Metaphors invariably break rules. They put things together that the grammar of the language, understood in the broadest sense of the word grammar, say can't go together. So what do you have to do? You have to do this. I don't know what this means. Nobody knows what this means, but it's worth thinking about. You will have to succeed in seeing humanity as a continent, or Juliet as the sun, or, we owe this to Winston Churchill, Mussolini as a utensil. It's a wonderful line. He said that when he gave a speech in the United States during the Second World War, that Mussolini is a utensil. It's a very, very wonderful metaphor. He means that Mussolini is now being used by Hitler. How do we do this? How do you see Juliet as the sun? You see Mussolini me as a utensil, see all of mankind as a continent. I don't know, but I know that we can, and I know that we do it. Now still, not everything goes, and there are various controls, semi-controls at work, and it's worth having a look at least at some of these, and then I will be finished, while also marveling at the human ingenuity at work when metaphors are made, and also when they're grasped. An illustration of the capacity for figurative understanding is a peculiar parlor game. The person who taught me this game, a professor named Lars Benonius, somewhere in Scandinavia, called it the game of analogies. I think it should have been called a game of metaphor, but in any case, it's a game entirely to do with the creation and comprehension of figures of games played this way. You got a group of people who are playing, and each of them takes turns. Your turn, you have to think up a person without telling who it is, and we try to guess whom you're thinking of. And we have to do it in this way. We have to ask single questions, and each question has to have the form, if you were X, what would you be? If you were a piece of furniture, what would you be? If you were metal, what would you be? If you were an academic discipline, what would you be? If you were a city in Europe, what would you be? Now, the thing about this game is that if you've never played it and don't know what to expect, two things are likely to surprise you. One, surprise me, is the speed with which the guessers will uncover the identity of the mystery person. It's amazing. It takes very little time. The other is the arguments that will ensue, all having to do with the accuracy of the answers. For instance, when I first played the game, the mystery person somebody had was Ho Chi Minh. Remember him? The head of North Vietnam. The war was on. We had guessed him. We criticized the target because he'd answered the question, if you were a metal, what metal would you be, with iron. We insisted that Ho would have to have been a much more flexible metal, something that could bend and be resilient, not iron, maybe tempered steel, aluminum, but something else. With regard to the first that the mystery person will be identified quickly, there is no doubt that the players know something of the target person, of his repertoire, what people he knows and knows of, and of his likely predilection for certain kinds of metaphors and analogies, and of course just what he knows of the category in question. How many metals does he know of? How many kinds of furniture? How many different colors? The colors are particularly interesting because a linguist named Robin Lakoff used to be married to George, who was once a really fine linguist, but in the last 10 years just writes one piece of crap after another. I don't know what Robin Lakoff does now, but she wrote a little monograph on the difference between men's and women's use of English. And one of the things she says, which I think is true, although maybe not in academic circles, I just don't know, is that with regard to more or less ordinary Americans of no special class, that women have control of very many more, like maybe 4 times as many color words as men do. So you ask women to identify colors, and they're likely to say it's scarlet, it's crimson, it's vermilion, and the man says that's red, that's also red. Well, you know this sort of thing when you talk to people. When we understand one another, at least if we really try to do it, we take account of how one another understand and use the language. If somebody told me that he anticipated certain objections to his argument, I may or may not suppose that he has readied answers to these objections. If not, the anticipated objections to his argument, I make an objection and he has nothing to say. He probably uses the word anticipate as a synonym for expect. I don't use it that way. For me, the word anticipate means think that something is going to happen and be ready for it. Expect means something else. I don't use persuade as a synonym for convince, but some people do. If you don't know what these people have in mind or what their repertoire is, you can't get the gist. This is one of the reasons why I think that despite my distinguished colleague in the social sciences, Susan Golden Meadow, who works on the development of children and their acquisition of language, I think we don't have any idea what's going on when children use language. Here's kind of an example. I'm still puzzling about this. I have a grandson. He will be 4 in December. When he was 2.5, a bad thing or other, cold, I don't know. So I took him to the doctor. The doctor said to him, "Sure, named Asher. He's undoubtedly going to be called Asher all his life. His parents speak Hebrew, so they call him Asher." The doctor said, "Asher, how long have you been waking up at night coughing?" And Asher said, quote, "6 years." Well, he meant something by that. Does he think it just meant a long time? Longer than I can remember? What? In the famous Piaget experiments, I have plenty of respect for Piaget, but he does one thing that just seems to me utterly unacceptable. You remember his experiments that prove that children below a certain age don't yet have the concept of the constancy of volume. And the experiment in which he does this got 2 kind of beakers. Each of them holds a quart. One of them is low, wide and low, and the other one is narrow and tall. And he discovers that when he pours from this one, the low flat one, into this one, the child thinks there's now more liquid. And Piaget concludes that the child doesn't yet have the concept, the volume of this liquid must be constant. Maybe it shows that. I think it probably shows that the child doesn't yet have the semantics of the word more. I don't know what the child means. Children are actually sometimes use the word old or big almost interchangeably. My grandson calls my daughter big. My daughter is 5 feet tall. He means she's older than he is. I may very well be going on with whoever these Swiss children are whom Piaget kidnapped and subjected to these experiments. In any case. Well, so background and contextual considerations undoubtedly are relevant in the understanding of metaphors, and so is what might be thought of as the logic of the metaphors themselves. Consider what can be done when one is trying to grasp a metaphor or explain it to others, perhaps to demonstrate to oneself that he's grasped the figure of speech. The most common practice is to give us what has been called a paraphrase of the metaphor, wherein one attempts to convey the import of the metaphor in other words. That's a peculiar use of the term phrase because the so-called paraphrase of a metaphor is almost invariably longer than the metaphor itself, because the word paraphrase usually leads to something shorter. We haven't got time for the whole report. Could you just give us a paraphrase? But when I go on at great length about what's going on in Juliet as the Sun, she's the center of Romeo's universe. She warms him, she brightens him, she makes everything. Juliet as the Sun is only 4 words long, and I'm going on with all this long thing. I know, don't bother me with this, that Shakespeare cannot have thought we would unpack Juliet as the Sun by saying everything revolves around Juliet, because Shakespeare was not a heliocentrist. Shakespeare did not think that. I don't care what Shakespeare thought. All works of art are like this. They tend to outrun their authors. And in the end, you may very well want to listen to what the author says about the meaning of his work. In the end, if Mozart stands up there and says, by no means is Don Giovanni about the seductive power of music, I would just say, go away, Wolfgang. I seem to know better than you what your opera is about, at least about that. Certainly is, absolutely. Come on, you're sitting there, and you're interested like we all are when we go to a performance of Don Giovanni. There's one thing we always are desperate for. We want to see how they're going to do the scene when the statue drags Don Giovanni to hell. Are they going to make a hole in the bottom of the stage? Will there be flames? Or are they going to fake out and do something, impish? But earlier on, you remember, Don Giovanni has one ambition in life, just one. He wants to screw every woman in the world. He's already done this to Donna Elvira. Now he wants to get her made. Problem is, The maid is with Donna Elvira, and she's not going to let Don Giovanni anywhere near either one of them. So takes his comical sidekick, Borello. You know where the idea in Western literature and Western art of a hero with a comical sidekick begins? It begins in Don Quixote, who is actually a virtual contemporary of Shakespeare. It was a pretty good period in the history of literary work, wasn't it? Don Quixote and Shakespeare, for goodness sake. Anyway, Don Giovanni says, I want you to seduce Donna Elvira so that she gets out of the way and I can get at her maid. Leporello can't do that. Don says, I'll make it possible. You stand under her balcony and you hold this mandolin, and she'll think serenading her. And we like to see how they'll stage this too. Because Don Giovanni goes over there with his mandolin and sings an absolutely ravishing song, and it works. So we're watching this and we're thinking, even Leporello, the comical sidekick, be a successful seducer if Don Giovanni will supply him with the music. And how can you watch that and not then think, who's supplying Don Giovanni with the music? Oh, it's Mozart. Is that what Mozart music is for? That it can do? You think that Mozart's great opera about music is the Magic Flute. It is a great opera and it's music, but the greater opera about music is Don Giovanni. However, we're not doing that now. So there is one other way of getting a metaphor, which in my view is rather more adventurous and even more interesting, and that's to go on with it. That's a way of showing that you understand a metaphor. If, for instance, I say to you, Miles Davis is the Picasso of jazz, I might say that. I believe that. Sometimes Charlie Parker is the Picasso of jazz, and maybe Miles is the Paul Klee of jazz, or something like that. My friend Jerry Levinson, conference once supplied, he didn't make it, but I didn't know until I heard it. Wonderful line. So difficult to understand. Wagner is the Puccini of music. Well, you get two for the price of one there, right? But suppose I say to you, Miles Davis is the Picasso of jazz. What could you do? Well, you could try to explain plastic imagination. You might. Well, if Miles is the Picasso of jazz, who's the Rembrandt of jazz? Who's the Dali of jazz? And you'll find that you will think of things. If in Romeo's world, Juliet is the sun, then who is the moon? You don't think Shakespeare wanted you to think of that? Of course he did. You know who the moon is? Some other guy's girlfriend. This guy's girlfriend stands to Juliet the way the moon stands to the sun. It's okay. I'm happy that you've got the moon. That's very nice. I've got this. You think that's the difference. Well, that is, I think, enough for me.